On a late summer afternoon in 1994, the roads of Missouri carried a story that would end in betrayal, terror, and death. Richard Drummond, a 47-year-old information technology worker, spotted a car stranded along the highway. Like any good Samaritan, he stopped to help. What he couldn't know was that his act of kindness would lead him straight into the hands of killers. Inside that broken-down car were Alan Nicklasson, Dennis Skillicorn, and Tim DeGraffenreid, three men desperate, armed, and already running out of options. When Drummond offered them a ride, he unknowingly sealed his fate. Held at gunpoint, forced to drive into rural Missouri, Drummond's final moments were spent on his knees in a wooded area, pleading for his life. Nicklasson pulled the trigger. But the bloodshed didn't end there. Days later, Nicklasson and his accomplices would kill again, this time targeting a married couple, Joseph and Charlene Babcock, leaving their bodies behind and stealing their car. What began as a roadside breakdown spiraled into a trail of cold-blooded murders. The brutality of these crimes shocked Missouri. Prosecutors painted Nicklasson as the ringleader, a man who showed no hesitation in pulling the trigger, no remorse for the innocent lives destroyed. Within months, he was sentenced to death. Yet Nicklasson's story didn't end quickly. For nearly 2 decades, he sat on death row filing appeals and clinging to life through legal loopholes. But in December 2000, justice caught up with him. Missouri carried out his execution, marking the final chapter in a case that began with one man's simple act of kindness and ended in horror. This is the chilling story of Alan L. Nicklasson, the so-called Good Samaritan Killer. AKA the Good Samaritan Killer. Classification: murderer characteristics, robberies, number of victims. Date of murders: August 23-25, 1994. Date of birth: July 25, 1972. Victims profile: Richard Drummond, 47, Joseph Babcock, 47, and his wife, Charlene, 38. Method of murder: shooting, .22 caliber pistol. Location: Missouri, Arizona, USA. Status: sentenced to death in Missouri on June 28, 1996. Executed by lethal injection in Missouri on December 11, 2000. Dennis Skillicorn, Alan Nicklasson, and Tim DeGraffenreid headed east from Kansas City to obtain illegal drugs. During their return trip, their car broke down. They eventually burglarized a nearby home of Merlin Smith, stealing guns and money. They paid for a tow, but the garage was unable to repair the car. They drove back anyway, and the car stalled again. Richard Drummond stopped and offered to drive the group to use a phone. They responded by kidnapping him at gunpoint and later leading him into the woods off I-70, where Nicklasson shot him twice with a .22 caliber pistol. Drummond's remains were found 8 days later. Skillicorn and Nicklasson fled to Arizona, where their car got stuck in sand. Another Good Samaritan, Joseph Babcock, 47, tried to help. Nicklasson murdered him and his wife, Charlene, 38. Nicklasson and Skillicorn were convicted of first-degree murder. Skillicorn was executed by lethal injection in Missouri on May 20, 2009. DeGraffenreid, who was 17 when the crime took place, served time for second-degree murder. December 12, 2002. Bone tear. Mo A.P. Alan Nicklasson once recalled the euphoria he felt after fatally shooting a kindly businessman who stopped to help when he saw Nicklasson's car stalled on Interstate 70 near Kingdom City, Mo, in '94. Late Wednesday night, Nicklasson was put to death for Richard Drummond's killing, nearly 23 hours after he was originally scheduled to die. It was the second execution in Missouri in 3 weeks after a nearly 3-year hiatus. Racist serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin was executed November 20. The executions also were the first since Missouri switched from a 3-drug protocol to use of a single drug, pentobarbital. Nicklasson, 41, was pronounced dead at 10:52 p.m. Wednesday, 8 minutes after the process began. His eyes remained closed throughout, and he showed little reaction to the drug, briefly breathing heavily about 2 minutes into the process. He offered no final words. Missouri Department of Public Safety spokesman Mike O'Connell said, Nicklasson prayed briefly with the prison chaplain about 20 minutes before the execution. No one from his family or the victim's family attended. The execution was the end of a life troubled almost from the start. Nicklasson grew up in Kansas City, Mo, in a fatherless home. His mother was a mentally ill stripper who brought home an assortment of men, many of whom abused her son. Nicklasson died bearing the scar from where one of the men burned him. Nicklasson declined interviews in the days leading up to his execution, but in a 2009 interview with the Associated Press, he recalled the trauma of his childhood eating Alpo dog food for dinner, watching his mother shoot up heroin. She once made him fight a Doberman for money, he recalled. Then there was the constant torrent of abuse from his mother's male friends. Nicklasson suffered from bipolar disorder and lived on and off in boys' homes for his petty crimes and institutions for his mental illness. By his 20s, Nicklasson was homeless and a drug addict. While in rehab in 1994, he crossed paths with Dennis Skillicorn, who had been recently released from prison following a second-degree murder conviction for killing a man during a robbery. The two and a third man, Tim DeGraffenreid, decided in August 1994 to make the trip from Kansas City across I-70 to St. Louis to buy drugs. On the way back, their rundown 1983 Chevrolet Caprice started sputtering. It broke down near Kingdom City, about 100 miles west of St. Louis, and they took it to the shop. They used the downtime to burglarize a home, stealing money and guns. Though warned the car was unfixable, the men got back on the road. The car soon broke down again. Drummond, a 47-year-old Excelsior Springs Mo. Man who was a technical support supervisor for AT&T, saw the three men and their stranded car. He decided to stop and help. The men loaded their stolen goods in the trunk of Drummond's Dodge Intrepid. Then Nicklasson put a gun to his head and told him to drive west. Along the way, there was some debate between Nicklasson and Skillicorn about what to do with Drummond. Ultimately, they ordered him off the highway into a secluded area in Lafayette County in western Missouri. In the 2009 interview, Nicklasson recalled how he left the other two behind and walked Drummond to a wooded area. He said he had intended to tie him up to buy time for the trio to get away. He changed his mind, ordering Drummond to kneel and cross his legs. Then he shot him twice in the head. "I'm laughing pacing," Nicklasson said, recalling the moment. "I started losing it. I wouldn't want this out, but I felt a euphoria. I finally got back for all the beatings I took as a child." Nicklasson and Skillicorn stole Drummond's car and drove to Arizona. When the vehicle broke down in the desert, they approached the home of Joseph and Charlene Babcock. Nicklasson killed Joseph Babcock after the man drove them back to their vehicle. Charlene Babcock was killed at the couple's home. Both Nicklasson and Skillicorn were sentenced to life in prison for the Arizona killings and also sentenced to death in Missouri for Drummond's death. Skillicorn was executed in 2009, even though Nicklasson took sole responsibility for killing Drummond. DeGraffenreid pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and did not receive a death sentence. Nicklasson's execution was originally scheduled for 12:01 a.m. Wednesday, but an appeals court panel granted a stay of execution Monday, citing concerns about his counsel at trial and sentencing in 1990. When the full appeals court refused to take up the case Tuesday, Missouri Attorney General Chris Koster appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. It did not return its 5-4 decision to vacate the stay until 10:07 p.m. Wednesday, with Justices Ruth Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan dissenting. Governor Jay Nixon refused to grant clemency. Missouri previously used a 3-drug method for executions, but changed protocols after drug makers stopped selling the lethal drugs to prisons and corrections departments. The pentobarbital used in Missouri executions comes from an undisclosed compounding pharmacy. The Missouri Department of Corrections declines to say who makes the drug or where. Missouri man who killed a Good Samaritan executed after a last meal of pizza and gummy bears. Alan Nicklasson killed a man in 1994 who stopped to help him and his friends after their car stalled. He was pronounced dead at 10:52 p.m. on Wednesday, 8 minutes after the execution process began. As a child, his drug-addict mom fed him Alpo dog food and once made him fight a Doberman for money. December 12, 2010. Missouri executed Alan Nicklasson on Wednesday night for killing a Good Samaritan who stopped to help him and his friends after their car stalled on Interstate 70 in 1994. It was the state's second execution in 3 weeks. Nicklasson, 41, was pronounced dead at 10:52 p.m. on Wednesday, 8 minutes after the process began. His eyes remained closed throughout, and he showed little reaction to the drug, only briefly breathing heavily about 2 minutes into the process. He offered no final words. Missouri Department of Public Safety spokesman Mike O'Connell said Nicklasson prayed briefly with the prison chaplain about 20 minutes before the execution. No one from his family or the victim's family attended. His last meal was meat, pizza, orange juice, gummy bears, and M&Ms. An appeals court panel had granted a stay of execution for Nicklasson on Monday, citing concerns about his counsel at trial and sentencing in 1996. That stay was taken up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which did not return its 5-4 decision to vacate the stay until late Wednesday night. Governor Jay Nixon refused to grant clemency, and Nicklasson was executed nearly 23 hours after he was originally scheduled to die. Nicklasson declined interview requests this week, but in a 2009 interview, he spoke of a childhood scarred by abuse and mental illness. He recalled watching his mother shoot up heroin. She fed him Alpo dog food for dinner, he said, and once made him fight a Doberman for money. Nicklasson was often removed from home and spent part of his childhood in mental institutions and homes for boys. He became addicted to drugs. He met convicted killer Dennis Skillicorn in 1994 at a drug rehab center in Kansas City. The men, along with Tim DeGraffenreid, drove to St. Louis to buy drugs in August that year. On the way back, their 1983 Chevrolet Caprice broke down near Kingdom City, Mo. They dropped the car off with a mechanic and burglarized a home, stealing money and drugs. The next day, despite mechanics' warnings that the car wouldn't last, they got back on I-70 where it broke down again. Drummond, a 47, who was a technical support supervisor for AT&T, spotted the stranded motorists and stopped to help. The men put a gun to his head and ordered him to drive his Dodge Intrepid west. About 60 miles later in Lafayette County, the men ordered Drummond off the road to a secluded area. Nicklasson recalled that he left Skillicorn and de Graffenried behind and walked Drummond to a field. He said he had intended to tie Drummond up to buy time for the trio to get away. Instead, he ordered Drummond to kneel and cross his legs. He shot him twice in the head. Drummond's remains were found 8 days later. "I'm laughing, pacing," Nicklasson said, recalling the moment. "I started losing it. I wouldn't want this out, but I felt a euphoria. I finally got back for all the beatings I took as a child." Nicklasson and Skillicorn drove Drummond's car to Arizona. When the vehicle broke down in the desert, they approached the home of Joseph and Charlene Babcock. Nicklasson killed Joseph Babcock after the man drove them back to their vehicle. Charlene Babcock was killed at the couple's home. Nicklasson and Skillicorn were sentenced to life in prison for the Arizona killings and also sentenced to death in Missouri for Drummond's death. Skillicorn was executed in 2009. De Graffenried pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and did not receive a death sentence. Nicklasson's execution was the state's second to use a single drug, pentobarbital. Missouri previously used a 3-drug method for executions, but changed protocols after drug makers stopped selling the lethal drugs to prisons and corrections departments. The pentobarbital used in Missouri executions comes from an undisclosed compounding pharmacy. The Missouri Department of Corrections declines to say who makes the drug or where. Racist serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin was executed November 20. Before that, Missouri had not performed an execution in nearly 3 years. In late August 1994, Dennis Skillicorn, Alan Nicklasson, and Tim de Graffenried headed east from Kansas City to obtain illegal drugs. On August 23, 1994, during their return trip to Kansas City, the 1983 Chevrolet Caprice in which they were traveling broke down 22 miles east of the Kingdom City exit on I-70. An offer of assistance by a state trooper was refused. The next day, they traveled 17 miles to the JJ Overpass. They burglarized the nearby home of Merlin Smith, stole some guns and money, and used the stolen money to pay for a tow to Kingdom City. A garage in Kingdom City was unable to repair the extensive mechanical problems. They drove back toward the site of the robbery and the car stalled again. Between 4 and 5 p.m., Richard Drummond, a technical support supervisor for AT&T, saw the stranded motorists and offered to take them to use a phone. He was driving a white company car. Skillicorn and Nicklasson were both armed. They loaded the booty from the Smith burglary into the trunk of Drummond's car. While Nicklasson held a gun to Drummond's head, Skillicorn asked Drummond questions in order to calm him down, including whether Drummond's old lady was going to miss him. As Drummond drove east, Skillicorn got to thinking, if we let this guy off, he's got this car phone. So they disabled the car phone. Skillicorn stated that he later determined they would have to lose Drummond in the woods. At some point during this time, Nicklasson and Skillicorn discussed what they should do with Drummond. Skillicorn in his sworn statement claimed that Nicklasson said he was going to, do something to this guy. I tell him, now we're trying to talk on the pretenses that this guy in the front seat don't hear us too. Right. Because I didn't want him panicking. They directed Drummond to exit I-70 at the Highway T exit. They proceeded 4 miles onto County Road 202 to a secluded area where they ordered Drummond to stop his vehicle. As Nicklasson prepared to take Drummond through a field toward a wooded area, Skillicorn demanded Drummond's wallet. Knowing Nicklasson had no rope or other means by which to restrain Drummond, and that Nicklasson carried a loaded .22 caliber pistol, Skillicorn watched as Nicklasson led Drummond toward a wooded area. There, Nicklasson shot Drummond twice in the head. Skillicorn acknowledged hearing 2 shots from the woods and that Nicklasson returned having already done what he had to do. Drummond's remains were found 8 days later. Wednesday, May 13, 2009. Alan Nicklasson. The other half of the Good Samaritan Killers was troubled from an early age. Dennis Skillicorn's lawyer, Jenny Merrigan, describes him as fascinating and truly mentally ill. Merrigan told me that at age 4 he stabbed a man he saw raping his mother, who worked as a prostitute, and kept Nicklasson in a closet while meeting Johns. At age 9, he attacked his stepfather, who pressed charges. Nicklasson moved from juvenile incarceration to regular prison, and at his last parole hearing, he begged the board not to let him out. The prison shrink seconded this, but he was granted parole anyway, and it was soon after that he met Skillicorn at the Salvation Army in Kansas City. Nicklasson can't function in society, he told Merrigan when he met with her at Potosi. She asked him to write a statement to be included in Skillicorn's clemency petition. Nicklasson's statement follows Alan Nicklasson's crimes are remembered not just for their brutality, but for the cruel irony at their core. Richard Drummond wasn't a rival, a threat, or an enemy. He was a stranger who stopped to help men he thought were in need. That act of compassion cost him his life. And for Joseph and Charlene Babcock, a husband and wife simply living their lives, a chance encounter with Nicklasson brought the same fate. Within weeks of the murders, prosecutors made their case clear. Nicklasson was a cold-blooded killer who had no regard for human life. A jury agreed, and by the end of 1994, he was sentenced to die. But the execution would not come quickly. For nearly 19 years, Nicklasson sat on death row filing appeal after appeal as the families of his victims endured a decades-long wait for justice. On December 11, 2000, that wait came to an end. At Missouri State Prison, Nicklasson was strapped to a gurney, injected with lethal drugs, and declared dead within minutes. He offered no final words. Witnesses described the execution as swift, almost eerily quiet, and ending far gentler than the deaths of the people he had murdered. For the victims' families, the execution closed a painful chapter, but the scars remain. No act of justice could bring back Richard Drummond or the Babcocks. What remains is the memory of their lives and the lesson that even the simplest act of kindness, like stopping to help on the side of the road, can sometimes end in tragedy. This was the story of Alan L. Nicklasson, the Good Samaritan Killer.